The Pathwork topic in January 2018 was Lecture 153, which is the self-regulating nature of involuntary processes. And as usual, I broke it down into 4 subtopics. And they were that it is the overexertion of the ego that creates imbalance, the role of images in unhappiness, the fact that you already trust involuntary processes, and then what the fear is about. What are we afraid of in terms of the involuntary processes? So on the first topic, overexertion of ego is what creates imbalance. Sometimes we can be in a phase of cultural evolution that we're not fully aware of. There's a story of how Sigmund Freud, when he was developing his magnificent, in-depth views of human beings, did not realize until the end of his career that he had been formulating this concept while within the Victorian era. And part of his genius was to realize, as the era moved on and the Edwardian era in England came in, he began to realize that some of his ideas were not as universal as he thought they were, that they were situational, even though the Victorian era extended over a very large period of time. My point is that we are all within a certain cultural context. We are all within a period of time after World War III, where there's a lot of global discontent. We have gone through the industrial age, or the beginnings of the industrial age. We are in the telecommunications and technology age, where a lot of things are going digital. In this phase of human development, different from 300 years ago, and doubtless different from 300 years from now, we have developed the capacity to control so much of our environment that the idea that the ego is overly dominant can be a difficult one to understand. So in other words, I want to use the word suppressing. I've always been confused by suppressing and repressing, but my point is by minimizing certain chaotic aspects of our nature, man has been able to accomplish a great deal, technically, scientifically, in terms of organizing their countries, organizing their life situations. So the ego has played a very large part in this. What I am suggesting is that it may be time for the ego to take a step back, that the ego has produced magnificent results, and there may be a place here where we need to rebalance the involuntary processes, the spiritual aspects of who we are. So in other words, the ego consists of outer reasoning faculty and the will faculty. The involuntary processes comprise feelings, intuition. So by suppressing, repressing feelings and intuition, we have constructed a great deal utilizing the will and our ego. And yet we may have left emotions, feelings, intuition behind. And the premise is that these go hand in hand, that they need to work together. That's a portion of what this lecture is about. So again, the overexertion of ego creates unbalance. Now, the dilemma is that the ego is the watchdog. It's the one in full consciousness in your life. And the idea of the ego taking a step back begs the question, then what's going to take over? Because if we haven't developed and been in touch with our feelings and our intuition, we may not recognize what part of us wants a seat at the table. So the second portion of this lecture is about the role of images in our unhappiness. And this presumes that there are assumptions that we make about life. And some of those assumptions are based on false ideas. We do not recognize these as false ideas. But the proof is they produce disharmony. Now, again, how do you distinguish the disharmony of your own false beliefs versus disharmonies that happen within society, within conflicts of agendas? And in this place, this is where this is personal work. This is not societal. We can take what we learn out into society, but what we're learning here is how to determine in our own personal lives whether there is an imbalance. And if there is an imbalance, what might that be about? So the study of images, which will be continued in February, has to do with the fact that if we have a false belief that we are not fully aware of, it's going to act out in our lives in ways where we might be able to see the results and notice that the results are not what we want, but not quite be able to track back and decide how we behave, how and why we behaved that way. Now, I quoted in the study guide another lecture, Pathwork Guide 201, which has a beautiful title, and that is Demagnetizing Negative Force Fields. And the premise of that lecture is, just as in physics, just as in nature, that like attracts like. So that if we have an angry attitude, we will tend to attract other people who either have angry attitudes or who enjoy somebody yelling for them. So in other words, if I behave rudely, people who don't admire or respect that will move out of my sphere of influence. But people who like to see rudeness, who think that rudeness has the potential to disrupt things, who think that rudeness is more honest than politeness, they will tend to gather around me. They will have conversations with me. They will make overtures of friendship. They will agree to do things with me because my rudeness does not put them off. So the idea is that if I have a basic belief that rudeness will solve something, then that belief will allow me to go down that road thinking it's the right road. And the question is, what are the results? Is your life the way you like it? Are you surrounded by people that you truly enjoy? Or if you're more honest, do you have a certain percentage of the people that you're around? Have you built an environment that reflects values that you're not sure you hold anymore? So this is the role of images in our unhappiness. And the dilemma is that what you are not aware of has tremendous power in your life because it's not addressed. Think of this like an illness. If you have an illness and you're not aware of it, then it can eat away at you. It can sap your energy. It can harm your organs, and you're not even aware enough to do something about it. A false belief, meaning a belief that if it was more conscious, you would not hold on to it, is just as dangerous as an illness that you don't know about. So this personal spiritual work is about unearthing what we believe, what we truly feel instead of what we think we should feel, what our intuition tells us versus what our ego tells us is appropriate, to discern the differences between these, and to allow a more level playing field where the ego has its role and true feelings and intuition have their role. Then the guide spends a nice section on how you already trust involuntary processes. So what that's about is the guide, I find it a joking attitude, even though it may not read that way to other people. He says you trust your heart, you trust your breathing, you wouldn't dare interfere with all the myriad processes that go on in your body, with your digestion, with your skin repair regimen. So these are examples of involuntary processes that your ego does not control, that work in synchrony with each other. They work well. They have an organization that nature has an organization that will normally lead a person towards wellness. Now, does that system go off kilter sometimes? Yes, it does. But across an entire lifetime, the amount of time that the involuntary processes don't work well is relatively small. And the guide is bringing this up as a suggestion that there are other involuntary processes within us that could also work well most of the time, that we are not permitting to come into consciousness, and that we're not willing to share power. So in other words, the ego says, I know what's going on, I'm in charge, I will make the decisions. And once again, if it's out of balance, it's going to not value feelings and intuition as much as technical decisions, logic, and reason. And that leaves a portion of who you are as a human being, as a divine agent, unable to come forward and participate in your own life. So if you think of this like a rebalancing, where the ego has been very dominant in human society, specifically Western civilization, for several hundred years at this point. And it's not that we want to go backwards, but we may want to rebalance how we address life, how we look at our own lives. So this was a section on you already trust involuntary processes. And once again, the majority of the time, they work well. So it's not that the ego doesn't have a job to do. It may say, you haven't noticed, but you have a fever. We have to do something about it. But for the ego to control things all the time means that passions, desires that would really fulfill you as a human being can become ignored or out-prioritized. So then the last section is, what do we do with this fear? Fear is it's a debilitating aspect of being a human being. So the guide suggests that growth is stopped when feelings are stopped. That emotional developmental growth, who you are as a human being, is stopped when you cap your feelings, when you don't listen to that part of you that makes you human. When we're exploring fear, suggestion is, number one, fully verbalize your feelings. Now, I make a big thing of this. To me, this becomes a little bit of a game, and games are fun. And why not put it down on paper? Why not say it out loud? But in other words, if you leave fear with its headline, something's wrong here, and you back off and you don't explore that, you don't ask, what is wrong? Why is it wrong? What can I do about it? So exploring your fear, one of the phrases I use is finish your sentences. So, I'm afraid. I think something's coming and I don't know what it is. Okay, walk through it. If X happens, then this next thing will happen, which will cause this next thing. Walk through the probable series of events. Then say, well, I'm afraid that if X happens, I will lose this, and this will happen, or I will feel this way. So in other words, put a face on your fears. If I do this, my boss will be angry. They're not they're already not happy with my performance. I could lose my job. If I lost my job, I could lose my home. If I lost my home, I would be homeless. If I was homeless, I would be helpless. You can see where this fear will lead you. The next step is to notice where this may be absurd. It may be true that a disruption in your life would have some domino effect. But it is likely that the fear is exaggerating and dramatizing this far beyond the practical reality. So, as well as verbalizing your fears, you want to notice every conceivable negative outcome that you are imagining. In other words, write down all these different scenarios. And the lecture says most fears lead to a logical absurdity. And by seeing how silly some of these are, you eliminate their power to frighten you. Yes, in an extreme case, if I got a splinter in my finger and it got infected, I could have my hand amputated. But the likelihood of that is very, very small. So I don't want to be afraid of handling wooden objects, but I may wish to take care. And if I do get a splinter, then I want to do my best to take care of the injury. I want to get some help. I want to call someone, have them help me. As a last resort, I'll go to the doctor. But unspoken, this fear leads you to believe you'll lose your hand if you try to whittle on a piece of wood. So fully verbalize your feelings and go down to as many negative outcomes as you can imagine. I call this worst possible scenario, worst case scenario. Have a little fun with this because you're going to have to laugh at some of the ideas you have about how listening to your feelings and listening to your intuition will drive you into ruin. You will be bankrupt, you will have no friends. When the truth of the matter is that as you close some doors, because some people won't like a change in your behavior, you will be opening others. The trick is you don't know today what those doors are because you haven't behaved in a different way. So part of the fear of involuntary processes is essentially a fear of the future, where we would rather stay stuck in the past than move into a plastic, malleable, not fully known present and future. And yet that's what we all do. We really all live in the unknown from minute to minute. But the ego likes to think that it is in full control of its environment and can preclude any negative outcomes from occurring. And the third suggestion that is in the lecture is to become more comfortable with fear overall. To sit with your fears and let them rise up without reacting to them. And learn to tell the difference between the grain of truth in your fear, there's always a grain of truth, versus the drama queen act that the fear puts on, trying to get you not to go there because one small circumstance may happen that it doesn't want to happen, the ego doesn't want to happen. So that's a brief overview of Pathwork Lecture 153, the self-regulating nature of involuntary processes, and the invitation to begin to explore some parts of you that you have not been fully aware of. And thanks for listening.